Ready when you are.
I'll be taking my points of information in the 5th minute. Please don't bother with the I'm going to be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. For time immemorial, countries like the United States of America and Britain have always had influence on multilateral corporations and how the policies within those corporations work. This has given them innate power to develop their structures at the expense of weaker countries. We oppose this particular narrative. We support this motion. Two burdens with this side opposition within this debate. Firstly, we're going to show you why this is a justified model, and secondly, why it then gains us more net benefits. I'm going to be doing two things in my speech. I'm going to start off with context and characterization, and secondly, I'm going to move on to constructive argumentation. So to start off, 3 things to note on setup. Firstly, is an account on what these international organizations are. 3 things. Firstly, these international organizations are entities formed by the collaboration of multiple countries from across the world. It can look like Uganda collaborating with the United States of America or with Kenya. Secondly, these international organizations seek to promote cooperation and facilitate communication with an aim to promote global prosperity and to promote development within our countries. But also thirdly, these international organizations include organizations like the United Nations, the World Health Organizations, or the IMF. Secondly, what does buying or selling of votes then look like on our side? 3 things. Firstly, it looks like countries coming together and agreeing on the terms of buying and selling of votes within their particular perspective. This means that their ability to then choose or their ability to be within those international organizations is then based on their ability to buy votes from different countries. Secondly, it is not only limited to only money, but it can also be limited to aid, it can be to items, or it can be to different developmental structures within these countries. Thirdly, it can look like Uganda wanting a machine to solve HIV, then they sell their vote within the International Monetary Fund to the World Bank in order to get this particular this sort of technology. Also, finally, it looks like selling of votes of a country in exchange for support of different policies that have been passed within those bodies. It looks like supporting policies like climate change. It looks like me buying a vote from Uganda in order for Uganda to support climate change and to support the fight against female discrimination within society. The impact of this characterization is that it shows you how it then allows countries to sit together and collaborate in order for growth and prosperity. Moving on finally, what then happens on status quo currently? 2 things. Firstly, in some international organizations, countries have a big percentage of votes within those organizations. This is normally the bigger countries like the United States of America or China having the higher vote within these organizations. A good example is like the IMF, where the United Kingdom and China have more than 25% of the votes as individual countries. This essentially means that bigger countries are always dominating these particular bodies without any sort of say that is gotten from those bigger countries. But also secondly, even if it is a one country, one vote system, this dominance still exists at a point in time where the individuals who then make these different policies are these bigger countries. We think that this is harmful because it keeps weaker countries weak and it only allows for the growth of the bigger countries. 2 arguments that are then going to be coming from our speeches. Firstly, we're going to show you how on our side of the house we promote global cooperation and why that is something that is good. And secondly, from Jibril's speech, how we mitigate dominance of these countries and why it is something that is important. So to start off, on why we promote global cooperation, the premise of this argument is that selling of these votes brings countries together into mutual agreements. What it looks like is 4 things. Firstly, these countries engaging in diplomatic agreements as to how these votes are then going to be saved. This essentially means that these weaker countries are also given a chance to decide as to how they want to sell their votes, because at this instance, we then make each and every country have one vote within that organization. And in order for you to gain more votes, it's for you to sit down with these countries and you then get these different votes. Secondly, it looks like countries assessing the things that then join them within status quo and the shared diplomatic benefits that they necessarily want to get before they make these different votes. Thirdly, it looks like countries seeking to see the impact that these different things then have on different individuals within their countries. For example, Uganda is less likely going to enter into a policy that is going to harm majority of the individuals within Uganda. So in this instance, you then first sit down and you see if it's going to harm different individuals within society. This essentially means that it gives weaker countries a chance to refuse the policies that then harm them within society. And that essentially means that these policies are less likely going to be passed because these countries haven't gotten this vote, because at the first start they all had one vote and they needed these votes from these bigger countries in order to pass their policies. What is the impact of this? Firstly, we tell you that it creates the negotiation incentive of bigger countries to negotiate with for a mutual ground. This is true because of the need for your votes, for the need of their votes so that your policies are then passed. This is important because it gives these weaker countries a say within different policies that then happen within status quo. This is important mainly because these weaker countries are then empowered at that particular instance. This is a form of empowerment to these weaker countries, and with this sort of empowerment, it then boosts them. Secondly, this is an incentive for bigger countries to then offer policies that are actually going to be beneficial to all kinds of countries. Notice one major problem in status quo is that majority of the votes within bigger organizations, these are like 25% of the votes in the United States of America. That essentially means that Uganda will have like 2 votes, so like 2% of the votes within the vast majority of instances. At that point in time, it then means when Uganda wants to pass a policy and like the bigger countries like the United States of America do not want to pass that particular policy, they join together and they then refuse those bigger countries and they then affect them. But on our side of the house, these bigger countries are sat down and they are meant to like offer policies that are then going to benefit these smaller countries in order for them to like get these sorts of votes from these smaller countries. Thirdly, we tell you that it leads to enhanced crisis response because it then quickens the response to different crises that then exist within status quo. Notice that when you then engage in an activity like selling of votes within the vast majority of instances, it then gives the different individuals a need to fasten the process, a need to provide the incentives to different countries in order for them to get the benefits of these things. The importance of this argument is firstly, we then cater for the welfare of the smaller countries at this particular instance. Why is this true? Firstly, the policies that are then pass within our side of the house are mainly policies that benefit them because these bigger countries incentive to then get policies that are going to be allowed by these countries in order to get their votes. But also secondly, we tell you that this then fulfills like one of the major burdens that we had in this debate to show why this is something that is then beneficial within society. What is the likely opposition wall and how does it look like? The opposition wall looks like a wall with no option for smaller countries to then have their policies passed within society. Why is this true? Firstly, because of the different structures that then exist within society and the different vote systems that exist within society of how bigger countries can have like 75% of the votes and like the 100 weaker countries then have like 10% of the votes. At this particular instance, it then means that in their world, majority of the policies that are then passed are policies that benefit these bigger countries. But on our side of the house, where each and every individual has one vote, it then essentially means that this vote is going to be fought for. This means that these bigger countries then try to provide good deals to these weaker countries in order to get these votes. This essentially means that these weaker countries then have a bigger ground to grow within society, but also secondly, majority of their policies are then passed on within society. We take this debate on 2 instances. Firstly, we show you how on our side of the house we get bigger bargaining power for the weaker countries, but also secondly, how we then help them in their development.
All right, thank you. First affirmative speaker, let's have the first speaker from opposition.
So, yeah. Okay, I'm going to be the first opposition speaker. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair, one thing proposition does not understand, or the dynamics of how weaker nations actually exist within status quo, is one thing they don't put into consideration. What are these weakest nations in the vast majority of instances? One, these are countries that are money incentivized, but then secondly, marginalized, excluded within the international community. What that necessarily means is that at a point in time, once these countries go ahead to actually have this financial incentive in terms of vote buying, then the whole assumption of global cooperation clearly does not even be clearly achieved from their side of the house. And I'm going to show you. Things we're going to get from my side. One, engagement of what proposition comes and gives us our counterfactual and run our fast substantive argument. What does team proposition come and say? Team proposition comes ahead to go ahead and front global cooperation. Why do we think global cooperation cannot actually necessarily exist? They come and tell us that one, at a point in time, since these nations need these votes, they're going to probably give these good deals and probably empower and all this sort of thing. We necessarily think this is a very false assertion, right? At a point in time, we have to understand that the mechanisms of how these votes are actually conducted is in terms of democracy, is in terms of actual equality and representation. What their side goes is at a point in time, these powerful nations necessarily have influence. And at a point in time with that influence, it means that they're going to set policies that necessarily benefits them. What that necessarily shows you is that they're going to put each and everything, or probably put these nations under weaker stances, or even give blind them with such probably resources or the so-called aid and probably help that these weaker nations are literally desperate for. At a point in time, once these powerful nations actually have influence and such policies articulate as sit and rest, what necessarily that means is that these powerful nations do have their influence and they're going to do whatever it takes for them to actually have the best policies. What is that necessarily detrimental? It means that these interests and values within the international community is excluded within the weaker nations. We have to understand that the countries that are desperately actually under administration and probably their interests are not high is because their votes are usually vote. What that necessarily means is that equality and fairness necessarily does not exist within their case. Now, what clearly shows, so with that, showing you that the influence of powerful nations and probably how these nations are going to just probably dump things like probably aid and resources towards these countries that are desperate for this necessarily shows there is no global cooperation. That necessarily means that these interests and values are excluded from the weaker nations. What's our counterfactual team opposition? Chair, we have to understand that we support and prefer a world where a country doesn't buy and sell votes in international organizations. At a point in time, once we actually go ahead with proposition side, it means that once people keep on having this financial incentive of actually buying votes each and every time, it means that even the analysis they go ahead and take within votes about of various countries is not necessarily actually taken. What necessarily means is that from that side of the house, equality and fairness clearly does not exist. Why does it exist? It means that the people who actually have a greater hand and these people who are actually powerful, people who actually influence decisions. That means that all policies and decisions that actually made within the global spectrum is literally for the powerful nations. And why is that? And the first expense is that necessarily done at the expense of these people being given aid, being given relief, and probably trying to help them with various resources. That literally outshadows weaker nations. But then at the end of the day, who can we necessarily blame? We can't blame weaker nations because it's literally they're literally desperate for it.
If many African countries were to come together and have a more voting share than the bigger countries, then if smaller countries were to come together, sell their votes to each other, such that they can pass policies which benefit them, doesn't that exclude the whole thing of bigger power and community?
Not exactly. We have to understand that the voting by incentive is at a point in time. It's like people don't have the shared or interest. It's a point in time once you're buying something from these people or selling these people buying this financial incentive, it means that these people are putting an expense of their resources or even their aid for you to actually take it. What that necessarily means is that these people are going to give you this aid or these resources, but then they're going to take the votes. Within these votes, what is necessarily within it is the better decision making that clearly does not exist with their side. And this is how global cooperation clearly does not work. From our side of the house, we think that it's not necessarily, we literally don't support the buying and selling of both international organizations. We show you the dynamics of how weaker countries necessarily work, and we support the equality and fairness. First and foremost, why do we think that from our world wouldn't have this country buying and selling votes international organization? This necessarily exploits the financial weak countries. The premise of this argument is that largely developing nations are greatly affected, excluded, and seen as marginalized. Powerful nations use this to their advantage. The claim is that developed nations will use such financial incentives to get a greater hand in representations and a higher hand within decision making and their interests. That is to say that these countries are basically, weaker nations are basically outshadowed. Why is this necessarily true? It means that the countries that get money is at the expense of their votes. How does it happen? It means that they're going to put them paying their leverages, probably aids and resources that literally probably fulfills their desperate sit down. What it clearly shows is that to give a hand to these developing nations actually promote this sort of bullying by these developing countries and probably neocolonialism at the end of the day. Two reasons. One, we think that these countries are poor. What that necessarily puts you in is a situation that was in like under the global stand and probably get the resources you need. And that is necessarily why these countries are financially exploited. And then second, you have to understand that these weaker nations inherently exist in debt. It means that they're going to use each and everything that they necessarily want to actually go ahead and achieve their debt. What that necessarily means is that at the point in time, they can actually sell their interests and values and all this at the end of the day, which is actually very detrimental. And with such an existence of voting and buying incentive, it literally does not show global cooperation. That's a one-sided thing. Why is this necessarily detrimental at the end of the day? We show you that vote buying exploits people and exploits these weak countries. We show you that the decision-making process is inherently manipulated. What does that mean? Is that I'm going to take you later. What does that necessarily mean? Is that the interests of these people are not well handled. At point in time, they're going to give you policies, right? We have to understand, Chair, that what you're giving votes, literally, it's logical that these people are not going to, like this developed countries, are not going to give you policies that inherently benefit you at the end of the day. Because at the point in time, if you're going to give you something that's going to benefit you greatly, it's literally to their loss. It's when they're going to use what you lack to actually benefit from you. And that is how we see that that whole idea of decision making within the processes at the point in time that they put interests and values of these people at a low stance. Now that necessarily be is that it weakens global cooperation at the end of the day. That is what their whole case stands. And I show you why global cooperation can't work at a point in time. Just because I'm probably gaining money from you doesn't mean that my values and interests are actually being upheld. And that is why global cooperation inherently can't work. So Chair, when we show from our first stance, we tell you that hey, global cooperation cannot work because decision making is actually highly manipulated by this weaker. We can show you the nature of these weaker nations in the vast majority of instances, how marginalized and excluded they are. Our counterfactual is necessarily countries not buying and selling their votes in international organizations. How is that inherently important? Is that these countries are able to actually speak, these countries are able to actually have equality and fairness and representation within society. And that is why we are proud to propose.
Hi. Thank you for your position, Speaker. So before the second affirmative starts his speech, please be mindful when you're deliberating on your benches about making noise and disrupting, let's say, a speaker or the judge. So be mindful of that. Right. So second speaker, proposition ready when you are.
Hello, I'll be taking my POIs. My minute of speech. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Hello, I think it is very much important and becomes more profitable when we actually attach a value to a vote that is casted by a country on an international level. I think it benefits the interests of LDCs and other countries that might literally look weaker economically and even as per their structure on a world level and international setup. And I think with that ground, we are very proud to propose this resolution. The characterization that I get from past opposition is actually not so much in their favor. Look what they tell us. They tell us that what LDCs or weaker countries look like are those that do not have capacity to access some things, and their ideas or their voice at an international level are actually not heard so much, and it's what it looks like, and they are calling for maintenance of status quo because it is what is practically there as a problem that we would like to really change and bring a better setup. What does it look like when any commodity or anything becomes a commodity? It becomes then that it can be traded off, which means that there is a seller and a buyer, and ideally the seller would choose the one who best offers what is good for them to sell off something that they desire, and even the buyer would be more incentivized to actually provide the best round, since they would also prefer to have that buy-in or able to access the person selling the commodity. The problem I find with opposition is
fail to recognize that the bias are not actually one. In their world, they assume that developing countries are one, and in summary speech, you can ideally see that when they talk about developing countries, they ignore the differences within developing countries or the developed countries, what they look like and how they have different interests, which ideally means that they do not link these countries would have to give some things a priority in order to have a wider buy-in, and in one way or the other, the weaker countries would be benefiting. What does the first speaker say? That there is existence of exploitation of weaker countries, and how wrong is that? Look, these people are taken more on a ground that is not so much like considered to be so relevant because they are weak, and she does not actually show us how practically this exploitation exists on our world and why it is practically very bad. What she gives us is what status quo looks like. But it's important to understand that today what is there, countries like Uganda go at an international platform or UN, and what they do is vote for the sake of voting because they are not actually given a reason to select a certain side. But when we give these people a reason why before giving off their vote, then they would need to choose a side. Two things happen here. When developing countries exist with what they can offer, as Weimar said, maybe financial things or even other benefits that can come along, it means that Uganda would assess whether to choose China or USA or even UK, which entirely means that we benefit from whatsoever comes here. We think at an international level and our nature, it would be practically better to achieve aid, get better facilities, get better policies that promote us and develop us than just exist in a world where we vote for the sake of voting. When we maintain their world, it practically means that we shall stay in a situation whereby if USA wishes something to be passed, then it would go on. When France wants something, it would ideally be taken on without countries benefiting. And notice that the relevancy of these countries existing in these organizations is getting some benefits. So in any way that these benefits can practically come, we think we are very okay with that world and would actually really defend it to the extent that we think we also propose this resolution. On a comparative panel, look at their world. Their world has three main problems that they do not actually get to eliminate. A problem of how these countries do not benefit from the voting, but even second, the high likelihood that the policies that are taken up are those that are not in the favor of these countries, but even third, existence of these countries in these organizations, they do not practically achieve what they would desire. While on our world, it looks like we've loaned a country or sale of our vote to someone who would give us what would help the country as a whole. That means in an economic structure and social structure, look at how it would look like if you're given maybe $10 trillion to take up a decision. It ideally means that this money is what is used back into these countries than saying, okay, it's okay, Uganda, go just vote for the sake of voting. I think that becomes very much problematic. Then also, exclusive benefits that we hold on our side, people are given a situation of being selective and take a good superpower or bigger state to support than what is actually there in status quo, where someone feels like, okay, if he dreams about UK in the night, it's what he thought in the following day. So we think that it then becomes very much bad. To do more extension on an engagement of how we address power disparities, the premise here is that with changing the structure of what is there, then we are able to have a better system of determining how we actually cast our votes and the factors that actually make this become a reality. Smaller countries can cooperate to promote their interests. Say Uganda sells Kenya come together and they say they will front a side that actually pushes and fronts interests of LDCs, if at all maybe it is a climatic goal that they are trying to achieve. What then this means, two things that happen. The bigger powers are incentivized to pass policies that favor majority of the countries, which ideally means that these countries at the receiving end are then more practically given more of better benefits than what it looks today in status quo. That is very much good because we achieve two things. economic development that of course comes with our side and the nature of setup that we have in our side, but even second, considering these countries and their interests to be more valid and important in status quo to all countries, not just LDCs knowing their interests without anybody that can front them, but rather here they get a better country that can actually understand them and push these ideas. So, Pano, we think it is important to empower developing nations because when they trade off, then you give them a higher stand to sell those that protect their interests. So, we think what it looks like then, LDCs that have health challenges, that have challenges in the economy, would practically be getting things like huge sums of money, but even second, better policies for machinery technological development. Why this then becomes very good is that welfare of these people in these countries are then practically helped or improved. Because we think what it looks like Uganda existing in UN is to have a desire or have a way they can help Ugandans. So it means that our world and our voting becomes more beneficial to the local people, even to the person who is on the smaller ground, not what it is today, that it is the people at the top that might ideally be associated with some of the benefits that come with the existence of these countries in international organizations. So to the worst of the worst, we cannot actually stand with what status quo looks like because it has not brought enough of the good that we would desire.
Thank you, second affirmative. Let us have the second speaker from the opposition, please.
Okay, I'll take my POS in like 5 minutes. So in trays, as I will take it, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So in today's speech, I'm just going to do 2 things. I'm going to engage on the case we get from the precurrent side, and then I'm going to give you positive matter as why we win the case. So firstly, on a bit of context, we have to understand a few things about these developing countries. 3 things. Firstly, we have to understand that these are countries which are struggling with a lot of threats to their economy. That means things like pandemic, things like neighbors which are currently affecting them. But even secondly, they are countries that have a lot of weak financial power. What exactly does this mean? But even thirdly, we have to show you that these are countries that are heavily reliant on things like global help from strong powers such as the US. Why is this context specifically important? It is important because in the case where these countries heavily rely on bodies like the US, it means that, as they said, in case you were to sell your vote to a best buyer, the best buyer in this case is going to be the US. We think that is detrimental because at a point in time when the US is the one majorly selling the votes to the Africans, in the event that is the one that they majorly benefit from, it means that the policies that get out of this voting are going to heavily favor the US. We tell you that secondly, even if it's like and even if analysis on what government says, they come and tell us that they believe cooperation between Africans will exist on their side. We tell you firstly, even if that is the case, we still think that Africans having the majority of the vote, first of all, it is impractical in the event where they have poor financial power to hold most of these votes. We have to do that they heavily depend on things like US, which means in the event where they sell these votes, it's majorly going to go to the US. Africans already have trade unions themselves, but the reason they rely on things like the US is because they're the ones who are majorly dependent on things like resources from the US. So we tell you that we tell you on that metric that the thing of buying and selling for Africans cannot exist on their side of the world. But we tell you even thirdly, in the event where this buying and selling is going to run, we think that the monopolization of votes in and of itself is something that makes things about the worst run. Why? When they come and tell us that their side wants to make policies that favor the majority, we come and still tell you that in their side of the house where they have manipulation of policies, as they said, everyone's interests vary, which means the likelihood of people making policies that favor the majority are significantly less on their side. In the event where they have one person monopolizing the policies, which means they can get the benefits themselves using the policies that they got into power, which means things like making policies for the majority are inexistent on government side. Secondly, when government comes and tells us that their side of the house wants to bring about mutual agreements between these people, we come and tell you firstly, These troubling countries are those that have a lot of threats, which means something that the possibility of these countries making a trade-off for something that is as equal as a vote is going to be inexistent on their side. As they said, trade-off an HIV solving machine for something like a vote is something that is very wrong or a very bad trade-off, because these countries are having a lot of problems, which means the ability or their bargaining power is significantly less on their side of the house. We come and tell you secondly, in the event rejected, I'll take it later. In the event where these countries need smaller things to sustain themselves, it means that the ability of them to bargain for stronger things or have a better trade-off is significantly reduced on their side of the house. Secondly, when they come and tell us that our side can't have policies passed for Africans, we tell you firstly, in the event where their side has a major bargaining power, which these African countries are majorly dependent on, it means first of all, most of the votes will go to their side. But even secondly, it means that the representation on the African side is going to be significantly less on their side of the house. We have told you how these countries are majorly dependent on them for things like aid. So in the event where they're going to buy things, it means that the biggest buyer is going to be the US. We think that is very detrimental, because things like interest of Africans, which you want to hold, will not be existent on your side in the event where they have the majority of the vote and the Africans have no vote or no say in the policies. We think that is detrimental. Thirdly, when the second speaker comes and tells us that they want to give these developing countries a helping hand, we tell you firstly, in the event where this is going to be less likely on their side because of things like the manipulation of the policies that better suit themselves, we still think that helping these countries is going to be less on their side, because they have the power to direct policies that help themselves directly, other than things like donation, which they will be voluntarily made on their side. It's going to be insignificant on their side, because now they have the better power and Africans have less representation. Before I move on to comparatives, I'll take your guys.
How is your side better with stronger countries having 75% of the votes? This essentially means that these countries then have no stronghold. But on our side of the house, we still get aid even when we send our votes.
Okay, what we tell you is this: we contextualize these weak countries as those that are heavily dependent. So in the event where you sell the votes, it means that there will be even less representation. That marginalizes already shows our side is significant. It's like, if not if better, slightly better to your side. But even what that then means is that you're posing a risk for continuous zero representation for these African countries. We think that is very detrimental on your side of the house. Positive matter. What do we give you in today's debate? We come and tell you firstly, the argument of exploitation. We think this happens in three ways. Rejected. We think exploitation happens in firstly, that these weaker countries are firstly known in debt, which means the bargaining power is really significantly reduced on their side of the house. In the event where these countries can come and use other metrics to buy or sell these votes, as their first speaker characterized, it means that the bargaining power of these countries is less. But even secondly, when we come and tell you these countries rejected, when we come and tell you these weak countries are those that have like weaker economies, it means their ability to buy votes or buy the 25% votes of the US is going to be significantly less on their side of the house. Secondly, we come and tell you in the point where these things like donations are going to reduce on their side of the house. Why? We come and tell you that in the event these countries won't have to have good relations with these countries, but rather make policies that favor them or make policies that will put themselves in the best situation, it means that even things like health or donations will be less existent on their side. So what is their worst case scenario? Their worst case scenario is firstly they have no representation for the Africans at all. Secondly, they have policies which are only suited towards the US policies. But even thirdly, they have further degradation of the economies of these African countries. What is their best case scenario, to be charitable in today's debate? We think that the best case scenario as for their side of the house, they might have something such as the US countries getting more votes, or the African countries getting returned back in exchange for their votes. But we still think that is wrong in the event when they have so many immediate problems that the trade will be something balance. We think that is not justified. So second panel, on a bit of a comparative analysis, which side better is more likelihood for things like continuity of growth in the long run? We think our side offers better continuities because firstly, we have representation and we retain representation. The risk on their side of the house is because these countries are weak, their level of representation or the likelihood of them actually contributing to things like policies is less. That is why the likelihood of things like global cooperation or things like continuity in terms of economic development are significantly less on their side. Secondly, on the likelihood of things like countries coming together and working on problems, which we think is important, and it's actually what these international organizations are formed for in the vast majority of cases. We think that cooperation is also inexistent in their side, at the event where the African countries now risk have zero say in the policies that favor them. We think with those metrics, we show you why we win the debate, why it is unjust, and why it will lead to the worst outcomes. I rest my speech.
All right. Thank you. Second. No, it wasn't. You had
I
45
think he had
seconds.
the bell and it was the
It's
timer.
that. It's that one. Remember, I said it rings at the same. It rings twice. So when it rings once here and once there, then you're disrupting him. So it should have remained quiet. But there's nothing to do about it now. So just so keep that silent, please. Okay, right. Let's have the third affirmative speaker.
Okay. I'm going to begin my speech. In 3, 2, 1, go. Chair, the side that wins is the side that solves the disparity issues, gives small countries votes a bigger say, and promotes a global society where policies are based on agreement. And I'm going to show you why that's clear in the proposition. Firstly, on clarity. I think OP doesn't understand what this buy and sell looks like. I don't think you buy what you don't agree with. I think OP's analysis is trying to show us like these people are going to be coerced to sell it, to buying, to giving a certain vote because they are poor. I think this is just intuitive. I don't think that African countries are so desperate that they will give out their values simply because they want money. I think Uganda has continuously rejected US advances because they don't believe in the homosexuality claim. And even though you don't buy into that, I believe that there are so many buyers. I think it comes in Jibril's speech, how there are still so many buyers and so many people who want to take up such a vote. That is to say, that's why most of the times in African countries for the past 10 years, the main aiders of Africa have not been the United States, it has been China and Japan. At that point in time, we believe that one, there are still so many countries that still offer a better initiative or a better incentive than US does. But even though you don't buy into that analysis, it's not just developed countries that give aid to developing countries. This thing is based on mutual agreement, which means if a country like Zimbabwe or Lesotho has something that Uganda desperately needs, and wants Uganda's vote, but Uganda wants something from Lesotho, such as a trade deal or like partnership in a certain trade agreement. This is when we give you the vote that we're going to support you on a policy concerning with climate change. In exchange, you are going to give us this and this thing, which means it's not only it doesn't stop at developed countries to developing countries. It goes down to the grassroots levels of developing countries, aiding developing countries they themselves. The second bit of clarity is that even though you agree with this whole thing, even though you take this whole idea of the US, how you depend on the US, I think one, it's an assumption that the US provides everything and that you only rely on the US and African countries will rely on the US. But secondly, I want to show you that when you have this kind of thing on our world, it gives US more incentive to front better policies. Why? Because on our side, developing countries now have options of colluding among themselves. Remember, let's look at the World Bank as a case scenario, whereby US, UK, and China alone have voting power of 23%. At that point in time, why US, China, and UK have a better incentive to now put better policies is because fellow developing countries now collude together to vote against these kind of policies by US. That is to say, African countries hold a majority of that, not a majority, but 32% in the World Bank. At that point in time, I assured you that developing countries can collude together to front policies that benefit them. That particularly means that it is not that these policies that are going to be passed are only reliant on the US and the US having votes. It's just not true, because collusion happens between developing and developing countries, not just developing and developed countries. The second thing they talked about is the whole issue of equality and fairness and how it's not good on our side. Their analysis was showing to us how big nations influence policies. I think this is not true. I think what the whole idea of this means is that bigger nations do not influence policies on our side for two reasons. One, because smaller countries now have a bigger bargaining power because they now buy each other's votes, which means influence of bigger countries is significantly reduced on our side, because at a point in time when developing countries now have that ability to collude and buy their own votes, it means that their influence is rising at the expense of developed countries. But the second thing that I want to talk about in the whole issue of like equality and fairness, I do think that our side better solves equality and fairness. Why? Because most of the times big countries pass policies that affect them. Our side, where you get better equality and fairness for non-developing countries or for developing countries, is because you now give their vote a value. And that's a key statement that comes into Jibu's speech. We want to give each country's vote certain value.
That means that we are able to collude, buy and sell each other's votes such that they have a bigger value on international scenes rather than currently where they do not have the same. The final thing that I want to engage in their whole idea is how like you sell their interests and values and how this happens. I think this is not true. I don't think African countries generally or developing countries sell their interests and values simply because they want money from the US. I think we have seen so many scenarios whereby African countries have not so or have stuck firm to their values and beliefs at the expense of getting aid from the US. A point in time is the US, and a point in time is the fact that how money chased away the French from their own country. At that point in time, it becomes wrong analysis to assume that countries are just going to willingly just say all their values simply because they want aid. I don't think this is necessarily true, but I think why they think that way is because I think they strawman this whole idea of developing countries are so desperate that they're going to just give away anything for anything. I don't think it's true. I think we needed to have analysis as to why African countries are so badly off, or developing countries are so badly off, that they are willing to give all their values and all their interests, even when they have alternatives, at the expense of things of their own interests. I'll go into impact analysis. I'll take your period before you go into impact analysis.
Can you give us justification why in any trade-off a developing country would choose to sell its vote to the US, a vote like Zimbabwe other than the US?
I told you this kind of voting and selling is based on who has what I want. That is to say, I give you a case scenario that if Zimbabwe and Uganda and other countries are agreeing that we want to front a policy concerning climate action and like reducing carbon nature or carbon like in society, what they do is that Uganda offers their vote in exchange for what Zimbabwe has in terms of a policy, or in terms of a trade deal, or in terms of like opening up free trade, or in terms of like a commodity like coffee that they may be having. It works in many forms. It's not simply giving you money or donations. I think it works in many forms in terms of buying and selling and what a specific country wants and what a specific country doesn't want. Impact way, two clashes in this debate. One is about global cooperation, two is about power disparities. Why we want the issue of global cooperation is two reasons. One, in terms of impact analysis, our side creates negotiation of bigger countries with smaller countries. Why this is important is because on our side, better policies are passed. But why is this more likely to happen on our side? On our side, bigger countries now feel threatened because they know that smaller countries now can come up and actually pass policies against them because they have the ability to buy and sell each other's votes. But the second thing and the second impact on our side is that big countries are now willing to give better policies. Why is this true? Because at the first point in time, they need these votes. At all instances, they need these votes because now they know countries like China or Japan are most likely to take these votes. But secondly, why it is important is because you put developing countries' values or developing countries' policies on a bigger scale or a more important scale, on an international scale. The reason why we win this particular clash is because we show you global cooperation is only achievable when smaller countries have a bigger say and when developed countries take a keen interest on what developing countries want, because developing countries have that vote, the ability to sell their votes. The second clash is about power disparities. I think this argument is very key because I think we showed you on our side how disparities are solved. Reason being, we show you how small powers can come together and their votes now have a huge value on the international scene. What that means is that on their side, power disparities of the US, UK, and China, who have a huge say on like the World Bank or the UN, are minimized because they now take incentive on the smaller countries' desires, and they take incentive on like the necessity of working together and forming a global cooperation with smaller countries. We take this debate on two grounds. One, we show you the inherent need for global cooperation and why it's better achieved on our side. And two, we show you how smaller countries get voice and get a bigger say that promotes global society development, where policies are passed with unanimous votes for both developed and developing countries.
Okay, thank you, third speaker from proposition. Let's have the last substantive speech, third speaker opposition.
I begin my speech in 3. So check. One of the main things we get from team opposition is that these big countries, these developed countries, are going to be more incentivized to pass the that favor everyone.
But what I want to show you is why exactly that is on our side and why we don't have the potential harms that exist in there. One, we say that in the case of these developed countries that necessarily want this policy to be passed, in the case where they even don't have to buy these votes, they will more likely pass a policy or create a policy that is favorable to everyone, since they will know that, okay, since this policy is actually favorable not only to me, it's also favorable to third world countries or second world countries. We see that we have that capability, or it's more likely for these countries to still vote without necessarily sending their votes to the developed countries. So, check. What else do we say? We see that. What did their speakers come and say? So that one, their first speaker came here and talked about how necessarily there's even in the one country, one vote system, there is domination over smaller countries because necessarily these bigger countries are the ones that make the policy. But realize that even if these developing countries realize that this policy is not what they want, they can still vote against it and ensure that it is not passed. Two, we see that they necessarily tell us that America holds, let's say, 25% of the votes. Why do they want to enable it to increase its voting power? One, we believe that in and of itself is detrimental because of the reasons my speakers gave, because of the exploitation of financially weak countries that come about and I'm going to talk about. Check. We also see that we see that necessarily the part they talk about of how necessarily countries won't agree to policies that harm them. Realize that a country like America that has, let's say, 25% voting power can necessarily buy votes from, let's say, 5 developing countries that can increase its voting power in order to pass that policy. Yet that policy in and of itself would be detrimental to other countries or won't be agreed to by other countries. But simply because America was able to actually, let's say, buy these votes and increase its voting power in order to pass this law without allowing these other countries to actually have their chance to actually put their votes in and be represented properly, we see that in and of itself is detrimental. So, they also talked about how necessarily cooperation comes on their side, how Africa can necessarily come together and let's say sell their votes to, let's say, Zambia or South Africa. But what we necessarily want them to do is show us a world where their potential harms don't exist, or a world where these things like exploitation of financially weak countries don't exist. So, check. What do we tell you as team? I'm going to take it. What do we tell you as team opposition? One, we tell you that in our world, in their world, there's going to be less fairness or less equality. Why? Because we see that we are going to be able to make these developed countries have more say in these votes. That necessarily means that there's going to be more suppression of other sorts of countries that necessarily still don't agree. But because let's say 6 countries still sold their votes to America, it will still be able to actually pass its law without these other countries agree. So, second thing we got is the exploitation of financially weak countries. How does this come about? We talk about how necessarily developed countries are able to bully these developing countries into selling their votes. How? We said that they can coerce them through things like, let's say, reducing trade or promising them to resolve debt. Like, let's say China can come to Uganda and say, if you sell me your votes, I can necessarily reduce your debt by 50% or 70%. When we tell you this is debt, because there's going to be unequal representation, because there's going to be compromised decision making, because it necessarily undermines the democratic processes that these international bodies are supposed to follow. I'll take it.
Does your side defend status quo? And if so, why is it that whatsoever you claim hasn't been achieved? Okay.
Sure. Yes, our side necessarily defends status quo. Now, what they are trying to claim is that we don't achieve the things that we say. But realize what we are trying to say is that their side has more harms that come about from selling these votes and selling and buying votes when they pass this policy and actually enable it to come. Why do we believe so? Because of the exploitation of financial weak countries, because of the lack of equality or fairness in our society. So, they tell us that necessarily developing countries can collude together and with fellow developing countries, because let's say Zambia may have what Uganda wants, but realize that it is more likely for USA or China to have what Uganda wants than Zambia or another developing country. So that means there is more incentive for actually these developing countries to sell their votes to developed countries than their fellow developing countries. That in and of itself shows that there's going to be that their world has more detriment. So they also tell us that necessarily countries that hold 25% of their voting power can necessarily just pass what they want. But realize that if these developing countries look at it and see that necessarily, okay, this policy is not what we want or is not what we need. They can still vote against it and necessarily disagree that that policy is wrong and it is not beneficial to us. So, Chair, what do we give you on comparatives? One, on comparatives, we have on their wall the increased dependency and lack of representation that happens on their wall. Why is there increased dependency? One, see that since these developing countries are more likely going to sell their votes to developed countries and rely on the things they give them, like let's say the machines they say or the money they say to buy their votes. See that this dependency is with. Why is it detrimental? It's detrimental because it means that these countries are going to go further and further into they're not going to learn how to necessarily represent themselves, and they're not going to know how to properly actually depend on themselves, and instead they're going to keep depending on these developed countries. Two, you see that necessarily on their side. Why? Because we noticed that you are the best person who can represent you. You are chosen as the president to represent the issues of your country. So we believe that it is not justifiable for you to sell your votes to another country that can't articulate the problems you are facing as a country as well as you can and present it as well as you can in order to make it understood and in order to make it addressed properly. Such a why do we believe that they have lost this debate? One, on the principles, and two, on the politics. One, on the principles. On the principle of fairness, when we see that necessarily there is no fairness on their side, or there is no equality on their side. Two, on the decry or the undermining of democracy that is supposed to exist in these international organizations. So that these international organizations usually work on a principle of democracy. That means you have a right to vote for what you want. And in their world where you can necessarily buy a vote from someone or necessarily even bully them into selling you their vote, that means they undermine the principle of democracy. We also see that it's going to necessarily undermine the credibility of these international organizations. Why? Because it's going to make these international organizations look like, okay, these organizations are just here for, let's say, money. Like, as long as you have enough money, you can get what you want done. That in and of itself means people will lose trust and people will lose faith in these international organizations. So, check. Finally, what essentially do we tell you? One, we tell you that we win because we show you essentially why on their side there are more harms, and two, almost all they claim of necessarily that cooperation that comes about and the incentivization of passing laws that are favorable to everyone is still on our side, but necessarily without the potential harms that exist on theirs. So on that metric, Jack, I'd like to rest my case.
Okay, thank you. Third speaker from opposition. Let's have the opposition reply. Yes, it's a silent round. It's unfortunate because it would have been proper constructive feedback. But anyway. Okay, negative reply. Let's have it.
Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So on account of the debate from opposition, I think government mainly loses this case when they make a contradiction in their third speech. He asked him a question, why would you compare our vote to Zimbabwe over the US? And he answers, it's basically who has what I want. And I think after the context we give you that these African countries are heavily dependent on the US countries, it means that in the event where you have they're heavily dependent on you other compared to their own countries, it means that they have more than what other countries, they have more of what you want than other countries. I think this is really detrimental to their case because it proves that even the likelihood of buying all these votes going to other countries as they try to claim all this collusion is really less likely on their side of the house. Now, what does that then mean? It means that all the argumentation we brought to you as opposition in today's debate, things like poor representation, things like worsening of economies, are really more significant on their side of the house. Because in the event where we tell you that they're heavily dependent on these countries, we came and gave you context in second speech. We told you, firstly, they're heavily dependent on these foreign countries more than their own countries. There's a reason for that, because they have more of what they need as compared to their fellow countries. And I think when the third speaker comes and says it's dependent on what you need, it kind of cancels out, firstly, their whole idea of collusion. But even secondly, it cancels out the whole idea of their case of these developing countries will have a say in what they need, or they'll have policies that will help them. We think they are full out on that side. But even secondly, on the point where they came and tried to tell us their whole idea of of policies favoring these countries because they fear that these African countries will collude. We think that also fell out in their side because of the high chances of us going to the US. And we think that is really detrimental, as we came and told you in our speeches, because in the event where the votes majorly go to foreign countries, it means that these developing countries have less representation on their side. So what exactly why does opposition win today's debate? This was a bit of a marginal analysis. We repeated the burden that the government put on us as to a significant problem. We came and told you that in the event of representation, of global participation, of global, coming together to solve problems, our side brings about this more. It's because we don't have that big guy who is coming to oppress you with your debt, with your very many situations, with your very many problems, and you heavily rely on him for a reason. So we came and told you that our side better solves things like global cooperation. It better solves things like their economies, they have their voice, they have representation, and I think that is really important in the debate. So why exactly do we win the debate? This was kind of a very marginal analysis. We came and told you that we win the debate because our side doesn't have that whole risk of this having no representation or having no policies that favor them in the long run. Majority of the impacts that we throw on government's case are really inexistent on our side of the house. And with that, we are showing you how we win the debate. But simple as that. Sorry, it's my speech.
Thank you. Opposition reply. Let's have the opposition reply to end the debate. Sorry.
You can supposed to use 4 minutes, right?
Yes.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Aside proposition, we would rather sell our votes and get $1 trillion to develop ourselves than take a side like opposition, where my vote doesn't mean anything because of the dominance of these bigger powers and them having a more threshold within the voting system existing in status quo. We are from this motion. The first problem we had with opposition in this debate is that they don't understand the side that they support. We tell you one major thing within this debate is that their side that they support, which is status quo, looks like the top 5 superpowers having 50% of the votes or 60% of the vote. This essentially means that when it reaches to vote for policies, it then means that they are going to benefit their interests. Even if I, as Uganda, want to go against that sort of vote, I cannot go against it because my vote doesn't have any threshold existing in status quo. But when we tell you our side of the house then solves this, we tell you we solve this because on our side of the house, every country has that one vote. That vote can be sold for benefits. Notice that even when our interests are not necessarily voted in the vast majority of instances, like the policies we want, we still get that aid, we still get that money, which is actually going to help us develop. That is basically what our side of the house looks like. The problem with side opposition is that they defend a side without justifying why whatever they say actually exists in status quo, because currently we are seeing this problem, right? We're seeing problems of these bigger countries having more votes, these smaller countries not having representation. What they had to come and do is to show us how they mitigate those things on their side of the house. They failed to show that they cannot stand in this debate. What are the 3 major things that we then get from their side of the house? Firstly, an idea on how there's representation as a democratic value on their side of the house. Firstly, we tell you that this doesn't happen on status quo because of like the threshold of the votes that these individuals have. This is basically a factual inequality from their side of the house. Notice that they cannot claim this because status quo, that they try to say that it exists in status quo, it doesn't even exist there. So this argument can then not be credited. They can't win this debate. Secondly, they come and tell us that, well, on our side of the house, we dump aid in that country. Well, we consider the fact that to some extent, we might dump aid. But this aid is important because this aid is helping us. It is better to have this aid than have nothing at the end of the day, which is their side, where we have no threshold in votes, where being misrepresented, where we do not get anything in the vast majority of instances. Moving on, finally, they come and tell us something about the dynamics of the weaker countries. We tell you 3 responses. Firstly, we do not get any clear analysis as to why these weaker countries are so desperate to do these particular things. But even if it existed, we tell you that selling a boat looks like a kind of market. This essentially means that we give it to the highest bidder, the one that benefits our interest the most. At this instant, we then get representation of these smaller countries on our side of the house. Now, moving on to the 2 major arguments we then had in this debate today. Firstly, on how we have enhanced cooperation. And this comes about because we give all these countries a chance to sit down and they discuss about the different policies that they have and the different policies that they want to follow. At this particular instance, these weaker countries then have some threshold to refuse those policies in order like for these bigger countries to then buy like these votes within the vast majority of instances. The importance of this is that firstly, you then give these individuals a chance to speak up on policies. Also, secondly, the economic gains that they necessarily get. We do not get any clear analysis as why this doesn't come about on our side of the house. We just get assertions with no levels of analysis. You cannot credit them. Secondly, we tell you that the bargaining powers are then very important within the vast majority of instances because they help these developing countries or like these bigger countries to develop their economies. They stop this sort of dominance of these bigger countries. At this particular instance, we tell you that this is then only achieved on our side of the house because of the bargaining power that we then create. Other than their side of the house, we then create nothing. Notice that side opposition lost this debate at a point in time where they decided to defend status quo without showing us how they remove the effects that are negative to status quo.
Right. Thank you for that debate. Please shake hands.
That room is a bit congested.
Very
All right.
Mikey.
Thank you for that entertaining debate.
You don't know how to lead.